Hi everyone, let's wait a couple of, just 1 minute so people can join. Perfect. So, hi everyone, welcome to a new scientific moment. My name is Julian. I am a researcher in the research and innovation team at IOB Labs. So, for those who don't know, the scientific moment is a space of talks that are mainly technical talks about topics that we work with, such as blockchain security and cryptography. We are accepting new talks, so if you want to share something interesting, don't hesitate to reach me out on the research forum or in the open Slack channel. So today is going to present Monty. Monty, he's data architect in Taringa, in the Taringa team. His focus areas are data architectures and scalability, large-scale data processing, data quality, efficient data models, and distributed web application development. He has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of IFE in Nigeria, and right now he's located in Lagos. Today he's going to talk about data access control system, that is about securing access to data by scoping authorization requests between microservices and integration. Hi Monty, let me add you there. How are
Hi,
you
Julian,
doing?
and very well, very well. Thank you so much for the introduction.
You're welcome. So let me add the presentation there. So break a leg.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julian. And welcome everybody to the talk. As Julian said, we use this space to talk about technology. We very like interesting or topical issues in technology, and yeah. So today we're going to be talking about data access control systems, um, and as Julian also mentioned, the theme is how do you like securing access to data by scoping authorization requests between microservices and integrations. Um, so I have a talk outline already prepared here. Just a quick mic check, Julian, if my screen is visible. Okay. So we're going to try and scope this talk to about 35 minutes. And we're dividing the discussion into a couple of areas, about 5 areas, right? So the first thing we're going to spend some time talking about is like, why do we need to protect data? So why is it important to do that? Why do you need to protect data? Then we're going to take some time as well to talk about domain-based authorization, which is really what we're trying to illustrate today. So we'll look at things like topics like what is a domain. We'll talk about protected entities, the concept of protected entities, and protected features. Um, and then we'll also talk about subscriptions and access levels. After that, we'll look at what's called domain controllers. So once you understand what a domain is and why it's important, then you have to look at like domain controllers, which help you to carry out the authorization activities that you're going to be doing. And then we're going to take some time to do a demo of these things, and then lastly we'll take some Q&A. Okay, so that's how the talk is going to go. So I guess we can start off the first bit, which is why do we need to protect data? So, of course, data is essentially the new oil, in the sense that it's really the most important asset that any organization has, whether that's data on your customers or data on your processes or the things that you need for operational reasons or transactional reasons. So operational data, transactional data, it's all very important to the business. So you need to secure that because everything that is important, needs to be protected. So yeah, you have to secure your data. Of course, even beyond the fact that it benefits the organization to protect that data. Just out of operational reasons, you also have like regulations, like the GDPR, for example, and some other regulations around data which apply in a lot of countries and regions around the world. You have to ensure that you're actually doing this. But for the purpose of our discussion, we're really looking at the security from the aspect of um, how do we ensure that we police access to the data so that only those actors that need to access that data can access it, so that it's not open to unauthorized access, and which could be a security problem as well, okay, or even lead to some violations, as we've seen with regards to the regulations. So that's something that you need to take into account, right? Yeah, so that's essentially why you need to protect your data. First of all, it's very important for operational reasons, and this is your internal operational data, right? So even in terms of competition, you don't want the competition getting the hands on your data. You also want to make sure that you are, keeping in line with all the regulations that might apply around data privacy and all of that. And internally, you want to make sure that the data is secured and only accessed by those actors that should have access to it. So that's really, why we need to protect data. I think we can move over now to the next topic. And then again, if you have any questions, please keep the questions. We have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of the talk, so we'll be going over your questions. So next, we're going to talk about domain-based authorization. So now that we've talked about why data needs to be secured, we now want to start developing a point of view around how we go about securing that data. The first thing we're going to talk about on that domain-based authorization, which is one of the ways you can do this, is trying to develop the concept of a domain. So what is a domain, right? So a domain is an abstraction that you create. So I'll give you an example. So let's say you have an e-commerce website, like where you can go, to shop. You can shop on an e-commerce website. As a the detail around the products, you're seeing the images of the product. So that's also data because it's served from within, the company's infrastructure. So that's actually data, but that much is public, but it's also part of like the domain. And then you have things like the shopping cart, which is private. At least it should only be seen by the particular user who's logged in at the time and doing the shopping activity. So, but it's still data. It's transactional data that you store temporarily for that session. It's also data. It's a subdomain under the domain of the entire website. So the domain is like a way to look at that. So like you take an entity at the highest level and say, this is what I want to secure multiple types of data within this entity. So the entity is the domain, and then you start having smaller abstractions as you go down lower. And so when you start doing this, so once you have the domain scoped out, the next thing that I was talking about, for example, the product pages, the search pages, the shopping carts. So these are things that you can call entities within the domain. So more specifically, we call them protected entities because they're the entities that we're actually trying to protect. So we call them protected entities. And
Sorry, Monty, for interrupting. You are showing
go
just the
ahead.
talk outline
Yes,
on the
yes.
slide.
Oh yeah, thank you. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
you're
gonna move
welcome.
to the next one.
Go
Thanks.
ahead.
So we have a little. Thanks you, Julian. We have a little diagram here around the protected entities. So we started by talking about the domain, and we said this is the highest level. So the entire thing, maybe even an organization. Although more specifically, you would really want to break it down. Let's say like the at the org level, there will be multiple things. Maybe platform level, then that could be a domain, for example, right? And then within the domain, there will be entities that you want to protect. So we call them protected entities. And these protected entities, are another abstraction under the domain, and then they would have things called protected features. So the protected entity is like one level down under the domain, and the protected feature is the actual asset that you're trying to protect. So if you look at this diagram, you see an illustration where you have a barrier in the middle, and to the left of that, you see users trying to access, the protected entity, and within the protected entity, you have protected features. So there are multiple features within a protected entity, and you have some kind of access control barrier there, represented by the padlock, and then you have users. So we have access control to regulate access to those protected entities, and then the features within them as well, right? The users will actually be trying to access the protected features, but the features themselves are grouped under an entity housing. So that's what this is trying to illustrate. And so going a little bit deeper into protected entities, you'll see, as we said, that you have protected features under the entities. But the features themselves are things like, let me give you an example. Let's go back to the e-commerce website, right? So let's say you have the page, right? So the page, like when you come on the e-commerce website, you could have, for example, an admin login and a user login, right? So there will be like certain, like once you log in, you're probably, as a user, only going to see the things that apply to you as a user. But there could be a way to get into an admin level, like if let's say you could log in with admin access, you'd be able to see more things. So more like back office things where you can, like see analytics, for example, on what's going on. You could spot some things, see session activity, probably even track some malicious activity, and like automatically log out some users that might be behaving differently from normal, or things like that. So the admin level might give you more things than what you see. So those are features, right? So it depends on the level of the user logged in. So for example, this diagram shows a feature, and you can see that you have roles, like roles. That's what I was talking about. So like guest user, and a regular, like a guest user and an admin have different roles. So even for the same protected entity, they could have different access levels. So like they have like different access levels. So for every feature, minimally you'd have a privilege system where we say, okay, so this is a feature. The minimum thing you can do is to be able to view that feature, which is what we call the read privilege. Like being able to view that resource is a read privilege, and sometimes you might not have that depending on your role, right? And then you have like an additional level to be able to create a new resource, right? So this might be like being able to view a shopping cart. So to be able to see a shopping cart, you have to be the user that's logged in at the time. So like a second user cannot see or should not be able to see the shopping cart of a different user. And if you're the owner of the shopping cart, you should be able to add items to the shopping cart and remove items from the shopping cart, right? So that is represented by create and delete privileges, right? Yeah. So that's how it is. So depending on the role, for the same protected entity and the same protected feature, there could be different levels of access. Yeah. So what we talk about when we talk about levels of access, there is a term for that. So the first term that we're going to use around that is something called subscription. Subscription, what it means is this: you have to be subscribed to access certain things, right? So let's go back again to our example of an e-commerce website. So let's say there is a newsletter section, and then maybe if you're just visiting, and then you don't have an account, even when you're just visiting, you'll be allowed to see products, for example. But there are certain things you might not be able to see. So maybe there are sections that you have to be logged in to see. So once you're a logged in user, you have an account, then you're automatically subscribed to see certain things. So subscription is basically saying that there is access, but the access is something that is redeemable and revocable at the same time. It's also something that can expire. So once you start talking about subscription, you're talking about that the access has to be granted, and it can also be revoked, and it can also expire. So an access uh, for something can be granted, that is, the user can be subscribed to see that feature and to interact with that feature. The same access can expire after some time. For example, sessions. So if you're logged in to the to the site, you can see some things. Then when your session expires, you are logged out again until you log back in. So if you try to access the same site when you're logged out, you'll be told to log in again to renew your session. So that means that your privilege was granted for some time and it's now expired. So you'd have to log in again, re-authenticate, and then you'll be able to access that. So that is, the subscription expiring. It can also be revoked entirely. Like maybe you have, let's say, like a conventional, maybe you've been banned, for example. Like you have cases where certain users perform malicious activity, and then the site admin decides to ban them, for example. If they're banned, then of course your privileges have been revoked until they're reinstated again. So that's the concept of subscription. Very key concept around this idea of access levels and protected entities and features. So you must the entity the user needs to be subscribed to the feature to be able to see that feature, right? So that's what it is here. Yeah. So I think with that we'll just sort of scoot over to the next topic. Again, please, if you have questions, um, you know, um, you can send in your questions in the chat, and we'll take them at the end of the talk. So what we want to look at now is the concept of domain controllers. So we spent some time, just to give a quick recap. We actually start this talk is about authorization. How do you scope authorization requests between microservices and integrations? So like data access control. If you would know about the structure of microservices, that in microservices we essentially have something called the single responsibility principle, which means that one microservice usually has to deal with just one thing or one area of that business logic for the entire platform. So you've got the business logic for the entire platform, and a microservice needs to deal with one as much as possible. This might not always be exactly true, but as much as possible, the microservice should deal with one area alone. And in doing so, based on the archetypal design for microservices, it would have its own database and exclusively control that data, which means that we need to create interfaces, right, for other microservices and integrations to access that data. So once you have that barrier where the microservice actually controls its own data, of course, it writes its own data to its own database and owns that data, then any other type of access is some kind of third party access needs to go through a layer of authorization. So we need to have rules that will indicate that, okay, so there's a call coming in from the calling microservice to the called microservice, and does this calling microservice have sufficient permissions to access this resource? If the answer is no, then they will be rejected and then they won't have access to that data. But if the answer is yes, that is if the authorization were to succeed, then the microservice will be able to access that information. So those structures are really necessary when you're trying to build a scalable system, and you want to make sure that it's secure from the get-go. You start building in this concept of domain level protection for the entities. Okay, so that's what a domain controller helps us to do. The domain controller establishes a data access control layer, as you can see in this diagram. So you have a data access control layer, and I'm going to talk about the actual design of that. So if you look at it, you'll see there's actually two areas in this plane. You have the subscription manager service, which on its own is a different microservice. So just to show you, bring you back to the bigger picture, we have multiple microservices within a platform ecosystem. So if you're thinking about the e-commerce example, you're going to have a microservice, for example, that displays the products. So what that microservice does is just show you all the products, which means it has most likely a product database, some kind of inventory database, product database, and it can show you the list of products, right? It might also have some facility to manage, like geographical information, like some GeoIP, geofencing information, so that depending on where you're visiting from, it can figure out that these are the things that we have around this area, like so that because like they might have multiple warehouses and you don't want to show products that are not available. So you would want to be able to customize the product feed, as it were, for that geographical area. And then, so that's just what that microservice would be doing. And then you could also have microservice that handles like general authentications. Like, okay, the user is trying to log in right now, authenticate this user, and all of that. So that's a different thing. That would have like a user table, for example. Okay, have a sessions table, and all of that. So some kind of authentication microservice or something. That would be different. Then you also have like a payment gateway, for example. The payment gateway would manage payments. So if the user is trying to pay with a credit card or pay with some other means, that payment service will handle that. So these are all different microservices. They are concerned with different things, very different things, distinct things, and then they have to maintain their own databases most likely, and that information ideally should be private to those services. But at certain points in time, as transactions occur on the platform, so on this e-commerce website, you're going to need to interact. So for example, maybe the product microservice that displays the feed might want to get like a token or some kind of validation that this user can see certain things before it displays those things. So it'll have to like communicate to the data microservice to get that information, like a session token from a session table, so that it can validate that, for example. So that information that it needs is coming from another domain, so it's going across domains. So we need to have something in between, another like a different service on its own that actually manages that. So where you can say, hey, does this service have the privilege to actually do this? And if the answer is yes, then you respond with the information. So that's what we call a subscription manager service. And like it does a couple of things, at least these 6 functions here. So like registering client services. So what that means is you want to have some kind of catalog of all the services that are in the ecosystem. So if there's some strange actor that's trying to communicate to the service, it will be denied automatically. So you want to have like a registry of all the services that are known in that ecosystem, so that you can start like having the first base of security. Then you have things like authenticating client calls. So once we establish the fact that the clients would need to talk to this intermediary service, that means that those clients would need to authenticate against this service to be able to get the tokens that will be used on the other side. And the other side will validate same tokens against this other service. So authenticating client calls is also something that this subscription manager service will be doing. And then, defining data domains, as we talked about before, like the domain, looking at it from the org level or the platform level and breaking it down into the different microservices, and then the different assets that you want to secure, access to. So defining those data domains is something that this centralized service would also be doing as well. We have checking client authorization. I've actually like talked about this passively, like when you have two microservices trying to interact through this intermediary service, the subscription manager service. The calling microservice will try to authenticate against this by trying to log in through their account, client account, to the subscription manager service, get a token, and add that token to the request that it's making to the call service. The call service will get this token and try to validate same against the subscription manager. So that's the validation part. And lastly, you can subscribe clients to these domains, so that it's on the basis of that subscription that it can determine if the calling service has sufficient permissions to go ahead. So this is a microservice on its own, as we've already seen, but we need to, like, when you come down to the development level, like, if imagine if you have different platforms being built. Now all of these different platforms might be written in, they're just different things, but to make development easier, right, you usually would have some abstraction in form of a library. So let's say you have, like, you identify, just very similar to how we build microservices today. So most technologies, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're doing something in the JavaScript ecosystem, you're building something around Node.js. You probably have a framework, maybe Express or Sales. And then what you're doing is you have dependencies, right? Libraries that you consume and utilize for, like, multiple things. So in the same way, we can create a library, like a domain controller library, that gives you an abstraction around the subscription microservice, so that you don't have to start implementing your own code to handle that. So to have a consistent way that all the microservices in our ecosystem can talk to the same centralized service. So we create a library around that to abstract that, which is what we're doing, in Taringa. And what you're seeing, the last part of this diagram essentially is just what we've really talked about. You have microservice A on the one side, let's call it the called microservice that we're trying to get something from that. And you have microservice B, which is the one that is doing the calling, trying to fetch that data. And there's the domain controller, like in between that. So there's that, indirect communication where microservice B will log in using the domain controller, get a token, and make a request for data to microservice A. Microservice A will take that token, validate that, and check the permissions, and if it's fine, return the data back to microservice B. And the only distinction between that and the partner integration is that the integrations are essentially not necessarily in your ecosystem. So this could be with external partners, and then you want to build, like, customized endpoints for them. But what you want to do is also ensure that the specific permissions that they have are enshrined in that domain, so that they don't have access to what they shouldn't have access to, and you can centrally control what they can access at any point in time, right? So that is the main controller, and yeah, I think we're now going to move into demos. Just to give some additional context, again, the talk has been around data access control systems, and we're looking at domain-based access control. We've defined things like what a domain is, and what are protected entities within those domains, and what are protected features within the entities. And we talked about subscriptions as, like, envelopes that you use to deliver different levels of access, right? So a user has to be subscribed to a feature to be able to access it. And even then, there are multiple levels of access. You can have read access, but not create access. You could have create access, but not delete access, right? Or update access. It depends. So those are what we call the main definitions. You can define all of those things on a case-by-case basis, and then you need a service that can sit in the middle of all your microservices to provide a connection, like an intermediary for all these things to happen. And that's the subscription manager service that we just described, sandwiched between them. And you might need to create a library, like an SDK, to enforce a consistent mode of communication between the microservices and the partner integrations, which we've already described as well. So now we're going to take some time to look at a demo. So as you can see here, we have another diagram, which is like the demo workflow. So I'll explain this workflow, and then we can go into the demo proper. The workflow is really what we just talked about in the last minute or so. Essentially, that you have two microservices. You have a calling microservice, excuse me, and a called microservice. The calling microservice is trying to communicate to the called microservice. It's actually trying to get some data from the called microservice, because, like I said, they're in different domains. They own their own data, and they're the only first class users of that data. But if another microservice wants to fetch some data, it needs to be authorized to do so. So it'll make a request, and then we need a way to check that. And if we can validate that, then we let it have the data. So how that works is, you can see there's a left part, there's a right part. On the left is the calling microservice, the right is the called one. But they're both using the domain controller. So we talked about domain controller, of course, like a library that provides an abstraction around your subscription manager microservice. So going from left to right, the calling microservice will log in to the domain controller because it's a client of the domain controller. So you have to log in there and then get a token. That's a session token to make a request, right? So it takes the token, then it makes a request. So that's what we're seeing here, where it logs in, gets a token back, and then makes a request with that token to the called microservice. So this is going to land in. So to standardize this sort of communication, all the platform microservices will have endpoints for data exchange. There'll be a dedicated endpoint for data exchange. So just like when you have the logic for the microservice, there'll be one endpoint that is for data communication, right? Sort of like when you're doing some kind of WebSocket based communication, you know that there's an entry point, maybe even a single entry point, and then all the messages come as the events come, they get filtered based on use case. So you're checking one property of the object to find out how to handle that. And then you handle it like if there's a specific flag for that, then you have different handlers, something like that here as well. So you send that request, it comes into the called microservice. So this might, for example, it's a matter of implementation detail, but it could come in, for example, as a parameterized route, and then you can get the parameters of that request, which for standardization reasons would always expect to be entity, feature, and action. So the entity is the entity that you're trying to access, right? Maybe like a shopping cart entity. The feature can be like the part of that you want to talk to. Maybe you want to get something around the shopping, around like the list items. Like you've got items on the shopping cart, you want to list the items, right? And then the action might be you want to read the list of the items, or you want to like export that list to something, or you want to do something with that. That's an action, right? So when it comes in, the call microservice will try to check that authorization. Actually, it will take that token, right, and then take all the things that you've requested in your like those parameters of the request, and pass them into a validation, method against the same domain controller. So it gets the response of, okay, this caller is actually permitted to do this, or it's not permitted to do this. And then on the basis of that, it can respond. It can essentially, if it's authorized, then you execute that data request, right? And then return the data. If it's not authorized, then you can reject that request with an error. Okay. So that's basically the demo workflow that we're going to be demonstrating here. And to be able to demonstrate that, I have a project set up here. So what I have here is essentially a Replit environment. So Replit is a space where you can basically set up like a quick VM to do like a test project, and you can just sort of run your project. But just a minute to reload this. So it gives you a VM that you can just use to do like a quick experiment or a test. And so what we're just trying to load up this environment here. So just a minute while that loads up. But just to describe the rest of the setup, we have um, essentially a version of the domain controller library, um, which is talking to a microservice, like a test version of the microservice. And then we also have the actual demo itself. So I'm just checking my network access right now. I think it'll just mic check if you can still hear me. Julian, can you hear me? So just checking. Let's see. So hold on. I'm just trying to make sure I can load up the environment here. I seem to be having some connection issues at the moment, but it'll just be a minute. I'm trying to switch my networks now.
Hey, Monty, if we can wait that the page opens, you can answer some questions that are
Sure,
on the chat.
sure, that makes sense.
So,
Yeah,
okay,
that makes sense.
can you see it? So Alex Brass is asking if did you use Keycloak on Kong to provide scoping authorization and avoid direct access to microservices? Okay, let's wait a few minutes. I think we are having some connection issues. Oh, sorry, I was on mute. So what I was saying that if you have Um, if you want to present in the scientific moment, don't hesitate to join our channels that I share on the screen. We are accepting new talks. Oh, there is Monty. I think you are on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Do you want to
Yeah.
answer the question I shared
Yes.
before?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So we have an API gateway um, that we use, um, and then there is an entire like control plane. There's an actual DevOps control plane that manages the interaction. So the microservices themselves are actually protected from direct traffic. I'm aware of that. There's an API gateway about this communication, and everything is being managed on Kubernetes. So everything is deployed on Kubernetes, and there's that security layer there with the gateway and all of that. But what we actually are talking about is something internal. So while the Kubernetes deploys all of these things and manages them behind the API gateway and some other like mesh network type things for the control, you have this other service internally in that layer just to police things with those internal microservices and the partner integrations.
Okay. I hope the question is been answered. There is another question. Can you see it?
Yes. No, so this is not. So the question is if this is the tech that's currently used for rootstock and Reef. No. I'm actually on the Taringa team. Taringa is, a social network that is affiliated with IOV. But rootstock and Reef are IOV, technologies. That's something very different. So they have a very different system, and of course very different security. That's a blockchain, something entirely different from what I'm describing here. But maybe you can go through some of the other talks. I think someone would have mentioned something around the security that they use for rootstock and RSK, which is, like I said, very different. This is just for a different platform entirely, and it's something that is just affiliated to IOV. Yeah.
Okay, I think there is no more question. Do you want to share again your screen so you can still with the?
Yes, I'm actually trying to get it to load up. It's not still loading up, so I think maybe we can. Well, I'll share and I'll try again. If I'm not able to do it, then maybe we can find some other way to get this out to our viewers. But I'm right now still not able to load it up. This I'm still trying to load it up here. But just for context, so this would have essentially just allowed us see what we're talking about more practically, right? Just in a demo, but it looks like the VM itself is having some issues coming up. Like I said, this is not an official environment. It's basically something that you just spin up online, and then you can have some code to run on there. So maybe there's some issue um, with that particular service, or maybe it's just my network connection. But I think we might be good to leave it here because I think we're kind of at time. So I think we can leave it here if there are no other questions.
Okay, sure. If you have any other question, please share it on the chat. Okay, it seems there is no more questions. So thank you very much, Monty, to share your presentation. So see you next time.
Yeah, and hopefully next time we'll be able to show them. Thanks, guys,
Perfect. Okay.
and it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Julian, for hosting. Yeah.
Ah, sorry. Shino is saying
So Gino has a question around talking about the features of the dashboard, even if it doesn't show up. Okay. So what that would have been is essentially uh, what it's not actually, it's like an environment where you have some code. So what we have there is that we have like a version of the library, the domain controller library, which is talking to a test microservice that is like a test subscription manager microservice. And then we have a demo where we have simulated the shopping cart experience, and you're trying to do different things, like trying to list the items on the shopping cart, or trying to update the shopping cart. And then depending on the access level that you have, which we can change, we can actually like subscribe the user to be able to access certain things and also turn that off. Actually, I think I'm able to share now. Let me just let me just see if I can. Looks like I can right now, so I'll just go over there. So it looks like it finally came up. So what you have is these two files. So we have this is basically like a base.js. This is just an example of a domain controller library, like what it could look like. Um, you know, um, Talking to a microservice behind the scenes and providing some control, right? And then you have here, I'll just make this area more clear. So, for example, I can decide to run node on demo. So this would just basically show you like the general flow of what's expected to happen. So, and as you can see from the right, you have some features like okay, I'll even look at it, show it this way. But then we can pick a feature. Then there's a login activity. What you're seeing here is some kind of token that the calling microservice, or in this case, the service that we have here, has gotten from logging in, and then it's trying to request a resource, which is the price list. And then there is a response back from the server that this user is forbidden to access this resource, right? That's an example of that flow. I'll just walk briefly through the code itself and the flow here, and then we'll just do some other experiments here. So you basically have this library, like your domain controller library, and then you can require that. So this is in JavaScript, by the way, and so uh, it's not there's not a lot of code here. It's really just abstractions, but essentially we have the domain controller itself and some tools that help us with our experimentation, like prompting that writes to the screen and random selection to pick from a list of options. We are plugging into some environment variables here, uh, around, like like I mentioned before, that each microservice will actually be a client of the subscription manager, which is in the middle. So each microservice will need to have like a client account. So there'll be a username and password for each microservice. So this already ensures that like an external microservice is not able to just come in here without being authorized, right? And then there are different deployments of the subscription manager. So there will be a base URL depending on which environment you're in. So if you're in the prod environment, that's a different URL. If you're in the test environment or dev, it's different URLs, right? For all of these deployments. And then you have a particular version of that API as well, which can change, as you keep updating the API. So these are the environment variables that are required to configure access to the domain controller. So once you get these environment variables from the environment, then the first step is to initialize the domain controller. So using the library abstraction that you have, you can pass these environment variables in, and then you get an instance of domain controller that you can use to make a call, to log in, to authentic, to check authorization and things like that. So once you've initialized the domain controller, the next step is to create a domain. And just like what we talked about before, in this example, we have a protected entity called the shopping cart. And then there are certain protected features that we want to actually regulate access to. So things like the price list, on the history, some metadata, or even a payment portal. So these are some examples of protected features, right? So I've commented out a call here that can create a domain, right? So you can create a domain. You just need to pass a protected entity and protected features, and you'll be able to create that domain. And then you have So now in this demo, if you go back to this, you'll see that we have a calling microservice and a called one. So what we're simulating here is that the calling microservice is going to have some request parameters that it wants to get. So you have things like the entity being the protected entity. You have the feature, which we're just doing a random selection from some of these features here. And then, of course, we're prompting to the screen so you can see something like this. Selected feature is whatever it is. So I can do another example. I can randomly pick one, right? So it's picking randomly now the metadata from this, and then checking if you have access to see the metadata. What you're seeing here is the specific token for that request, which is different, of course, from this other one here. You can check the last couple of letters in the string. It's different. So every time it's a different one. So then you have different like actions you can perform. So right now in this domain that we have for this test or this demo, we have things like read, write, and update. These are the things you can do. And so, for example, um, it's what it's doing is just checking read, and then trying to find out if like any random like if for any random feature you have like read access, and it's letting you know. In this case, the two ones we've done are forbidden. So let me see, maybe by chance this other one is okay. It's also forbidden because it's metadata. For the price list, still forbidden. Hopefully we'll get one that we can see. Fine. So this is the history. So for history, the user is authorized to access this resource. So that's just to show that although we've already gone to set those things, and what I'm going to do later in the demo is actually change those permissions. So we know, for example, that you can access the history one, right? So I can take, for example, the feature, but you can't access, say, the payment portal because they said user is forbidden to access this resource. So we're going to try to see if we can change that. But before we do that, we need to talk about what's going on here. And what you see here is that there's a calling service, and it's doing the login and sending the request, which is what you see here, logging in, sending the request over to that side. So we do a login here. So you just like await. These are asynchronous operations you have to await. So you await the login. And what that does is after logging in as a user, based on these environment variables here, right? You'll be able to get a token back. So there's a token attached to the object, which we can get that token, which we're prompting to the screen, which is why you see it being printed out here. And then after that, then on the call service side, which we're simulating, we're checking if, so there's a check authorized method that you can check on the main controller if, so you just pass in the token, right? So there's a token that's come back, and then you pass the parameters of the request, so the entity, the feature, and the action. And then you just get the status and prompt that. That's essentially what's happening here. So just so, and we've of course seen some like random examples. Like if I just randomly pick something here, we know that for the metadata feature, this user is not able to access that. It's forbidden right now. So if we want to change that, for example, we can try to like fix this. So we'll say the feature probably shouldn't be random. We'll just make it exactly what we want it to be, which is metadata, right? And then we can uh, manage user permissions here. So we'll just uncomment this line. So the entity is still the same entity. The feature is now metadata. The action is read, and we want to grant this permission. So you can either grant or deny, but let's just try to grant, and let's see what happens. So I'm going to try this again. Okay. So now we can see that the selected feature is metadata, and the user is authorized to access this resource, right? So just before that, we saw that the same feature metadata, the user is forbidden because the original rules of that domain did not allow it to happen. But we have been able to manage that permission, and we've granted that access level. And like I said, there are multiple access levels. For example, there is read, there is write, and update, and so on. So you can have permissions now to read, which we can just try that again, and just to confirm that. I'll just run this again, still on metadata because we fixed that. User is authorized to access the resource under read action. So we're going to try to change the action. Maybe let's go to the update action, right? that you can read doesn't mean you can do other things. So let's see if that's so. The user is actually forbidden to access the resource under updates, but they can access under read. So we can actually now try to grant this permission for this action, right? By just uncommenting that previous line. Of course, the action will now be update, and we want to grant it, right? I'll clear the screen. We can just do this again one last time. So now the user is authorized to do the update. So that's basically the demo. Essentially, you have there's a service and there's a library, and then you can manage that control plane of authorization by mapping out the domain, and then you have levels of action. And so something like this, for example, would have so this managing permissions would be scoped out to the this is like a domain level thing. So maybe when somebody or a user performs some required just some requirements, then they can be given permissions or like elevated permissions. So, for example, if you look at cloud environment and then you don't have access to do certain things, maybe you need to enable those things. And when you do that, then you have access. This could be something like that. Or the certain paid features that you don't have access to, then maybe when you pay, for example, then you have access to those features. That's essentially what we've been able to demonstrate here, which is essentially what the domain level access control is all about. So I don't know if there are new questions now, Julian.
No questions, and also we are running out of time, so I think we can conclude here. If you're okay. Sure. Okay. Well, again,
Yeah,
thank you
I'm
very
fine with
much,
that. Thank
Monty.
you so much. I'm glad I was able to show my demo.
Yeah, me too. So see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Yes. Bye, Julian. Thank you so much. Bye bye.